Chapter 28 Theodore Roosevelt of a Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Treasure of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 28 Theodore Roosevelt. Among the great men who have been President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt holds a unique position. Although he had no great trial to undergo in the term of his office, no trial similar to what Washington and Lincoln were forced to endure, he endeared himself to his fellow countrymen almost equally with these two for his splendid Americanism, his vitality, his kindness, and the force of his personality. After his term of office ended, and when he was a simple citizen once more, the bare word of Roosevelt's opinion had more influence on the country than the utterance of any public man who still held office. For the power of Roosevelt as a man and an American was greater than any other in the nation. Roosevelt was born in New York City as his fathers had been before him for 6 generations. He was the son of Theodore Roosevelt, a glass manufacturer, and of a Southern girl named Martha Bullock, who came from Georgia. Both his father and mother were unusual people, and of a quality to have a son whose greatness might be of the first magnitude. But until Roosevelt had graduated from college, he showed no signs that he was different from other boys. He did not even seem to have been given the same chance for success that is granted to other boys. For from his infancy his health was feeble. He was undersized and nervous, and suffered so greatly from asthma and other troubles that he was not able to attend school regularly. When he was still a small boy, however, he made a resolution to gain the bodily strength that he needed, and set about conquering the weaknesses that handicapped him. He secured a set of boxing gloves from his father, and with great determination went to work to learn how to defend himself from the other boys in his neighborhood, who were prone to annoy him because he was an easy victim. He became fond of athletics of all kinds, and was intensely interested in naturalism, intending at one time to make science his life work. And he drilled himself in doing the things that were difficult for him to do, until, though naturally somewhat timid or shy, he did not know the meaning of the word fear, and has been looked on as a prodigy of courage, both physical and moral. Roosevelt was popular in Harvard University and gained a number of steadfast friends who stood by him throughout his life. He received his degree of Bachelor of Arts in 1880, and soon after married a girl named Alice Lee. After a brief trip to Europe, where he climbed the Matterhorn in Switzerland, he settled down to the study of law in Columbia University, and at the same time learned its more practical side in the downtown law offices of a relative. But Roosevelt had not yet found himself. He had no love for the law, and cast about for some career in which his natural energy could show itself to better advantage. He no longer desired to be a naturalist, for the scientific side of that profession was too sedentary for him. He had wished to be an author, and for some time had been working on A History of the War of 1812, which was published soon after he left Harvard. But in politics he found the career he was seeking, and soon became influential in the Republican club of the Assembly district to which he belonged, where, in spite of the fact that he was considered a silk stocking because he was a gentleman, he gained the liking of the political bosses, and was elected to the State Assembly. The slightly built young man, wearing glasses, and with the reputation of a college dude, was not taken seriously in the Assembly at first, but it was not long before he had become one of its leaders and a man of national reputation. He won fame in his first term by rising one day and demanding that a certain judge be impeached. He was received with ridicule and laughter, and was warned not to injure the party or to make loose charges that might cause trouble. He stood alone, a young and inexperienced man, against the combined weight of machine politics in the state, and it was practically certain that his own political future was dead as a result of his act. But in spite of this, Roosevelt demanded once more that the judge be impeached, and kept up his demand until he was supported by certain newspapers. At last his action resulted in a statewide cry for the impeachment of the judge, and the Assembly, which could not afford to ignore the letters and newspaper articles which came pouring in, was compelled to give in and do as Roosevelt had demanded. At another time he was attacked by a bully, an ex-prize fighter who was hired by some of his enemies to teach him the rewards to be won from meddling. The result was unexpected. The bully went sprawling, knocked down by a well-directed blow from the undersized, bespectacled young assemblyman, and some of the gang that attempted to bring aid to the fallen also found themselves upon the floor. Roosevelt, flashing his teeth in characteristic manner, told the little knot of his enemies who had gathered to witness the affair that he was much obliged to them, that he hadn't enjoyed himself so much since he had been in the Assembly. A terrible and bitter sorrow ended Roosevelt's political career for the time being. His mother, to whom he was devotedly attached, died in 1884, and only 12 hours after this his wife, who had just borne him a daughter, died also. Roosevelt's father had already passed away, and this double tragedy was too much for him. He quitted politics and bought a ranch in Dakota where he hoped to find forgetfulness from sorrow, and in a short time he was leading the wild life of a cowboy, roping steers and riding horseback from the first break of dawn until far after dark. For 2 years Roosevelt remained in his ranch on the Little Missouri River, hunting, cow-punching, and engaging heart and soul in the free and strenuous life of the West. He did some writing, but believed that his political career was ended for good and all, and he believed, too, that he had become a Westerner and should remain one. But he had not been forgotten in the East, and before he was 30 years old he returned to New York by invitation to run on the Republican ticket for mayor. He was badly beaten, and for a time retired again from politics, traveling in Europe. In London he married again, this time a girl whom he had known from his early boyhood, named Edith Kermit Carow. Roosevelt was not long out of public life. 2 years after he had been beaten as mayor, he was appointed on the Civil Service Commission, and worked hard and with great ability for 6 years. Then he was made president of the Police Board of New York City, where he found a fight to his liking. The New York police were notoriously corrupt, and Roosevelt entered with all his might into the task of reorganizing and cleaning up his department. He was thoroughly successful, and not only left a more efficient and cleaner police, but added to the national reputation that he had already acquired. Before his term as president of the police board had ended, he was offered the position of assistant secretary of the Navy by President McKinley, and accepted with alacrity. Roosevelt had always been a staunch advocate of national preparedness for war, and was delighted to have the opportunity of aiding this cause himself. He did what he could for the Navy, and it was due to him more than any other man that Admiral Dewey was well supplied with fuel and munitions when war broke out with Spain, that he was able to attack the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without delay. But Roosevelt was not content with working at a desk when his country was at war. He recruited a regiment of cavalry called the Rough Riders, and made up largely from the cowboys and Westerners he had known in Dakota, although it included men from all parts of the United States. This regiment was placed under the command of Roosevelt's friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, and Roosevelt himself received the appointment of lieutenant colonel. He could have had the command of the regiment, but did not think that he knew enough about army administration, and it was due to Roosevelt that Leonard Wood received the colonelcy. The Rough Riders were sent promptly to Cuba, and when Colonel Wood was promoted to the rank of brigadier general, Roosevelt took charge of the regiment and personally led it into action at San Juan Hill, where he fought with the utmost gallantry. As his men charged up the hill, Roosevelt's horse was killed under him, and with drawn sword he led his men on foot, the most conspicuous target to be seen, far ahead of his men, yelling and cheering them on until they swarmed over the hilltop, and the Spaniards were driven from the field. When the war ended, Roosevelt returned to New York in a blaze of glory. The Republicans took advantage of his popularity and nominated him for governor of New York. He was elected by a large majority, and began at Albany once more the work of reform that he had carried on so courageously as a member of the Assembly and on the Civil Service and Police Commissions. It was necessary for Roosevelt to gain the goodwill of the party leaders, for without the support of the Republican machine he could accomplish little at Albany. His administration was fearless and at the same time tactful, and he soon had a reputation for being the leading figure in progressive American politics. But he was feared and distrusted by many of the machine politicians, who were compelled to recognize his ability and look on him in the light of a possible President of the United States. So when Roosevelt's second term as governor ended, strong efforts were made to force on him the office of Vice President, by which his enemies hoped he would be safely put out of the way for 4 years at least, and that his political career might be ended for good and all. In addition to the efforts of his enemies to gain this position for him, Roosevelt's admirers throughout the country joined the demand, thinking that the position was both an honor and a step forward, and the demand was so strong that Roosevelt could not refuse, but accepted the nomination to the huge delight of those who were afraid of him. Roosevelt and McKinley were elected to office in 1900. Roosevelt had thrown himself into the campaign with characteristic energy, and had traveled north and south and east and west almost as many miles as would girdle the globe, while his eyeglasses and teeth were seen and his fiery speeches heard by millions of Americans. It is said that on this trip Roosevelt made nearly 700 speeches. The result was plain. The election was a Republican landslide, and in March, 1901, Roosevelt entered his new duties. Fate was against the men who had wanted him shelved, for in September of the year when he entered office, the martyr McKinley was laid low by the bullet of a red anarchist, and Roosevelt was called upon to take up the reins of government. He was in the Adirondack Mountains at the time of the assassination, and he made his way to Buffalo as speedily as possible, taking a dangerous drive in the dark over a mountain road at a full gallop. The eyes of the nation were now centered on this comparatively young man who was called to the post of chief executive in so trying a manner, and Roosevelt's first public act was such as to inspire the utmost confidence in him, for he declared that he would follow out the McKinley policies and retain the McKinley cabinet. Throughout his term he strove conscientiously to keep the letter of his promise, although it was inevitable that with his own powerful character the trend of the administration must be changed. His conduct of domestic as well as foreign affairs, says Herman Hagedorn, was fearless and vigorous. He saw clearly that the question of most vital importance before the country was the control and strict regulation of the great corporations. In the famous Northern Securities merger he presented a test case to the Supreme Court, which ultimately opened the way for the prosecution of the other great corporations which had violated the Sherman antitrust law. His fight against the conservative forces of both parties on this question and kindred matters of railroad regulation was intensely bitter and extended throughout his period of office. His dealings with labor were equally far-sighted and firm. He favored combinations of labor as he favored combinations of capital, but stood as firmly against lawlessness on the part of laboring men as he stood against it on the part of capitalists. At last, said one of the labor men at a luncheon one day, there is a hearing for us fellows. Yes, cried the President emphatically, the White House door, while I am here, shall swing open as easily for the labor man as for the capitalist, and no easier. One of Roosevelt's greatest pieces of diplomacy that was kept secret at the time, and is such a striking example of his complete and utter fearlessness, is his dealing with the German Kaiser in 1901, when Germany broke off diplomatic relations with Venezuela and prepared to occupy Venezuelan territory by force of arms. Roosevelt called the German ambassador to the White House. He told him that unless the Kaiser arbitrated the matter with Venezuela, the American fleet under Admiral Dewey would be sent to Venezuelan waters to prevent any hostilities that the Germans might undertake. He stated this as a fact, he said, not as a threat, and he gave the German government a week to accede to his request. As the week passed without word from Germany, Roosevelt told the ambassador that in view of the Kaiser's silence, the American fleet would sail a day earlier than had been planned, and as promptly as cables could do the work, Germany gave in and consented to arbitration. Roosevelt's prompt action in this matter and the courageous stand he took with the Berlin government undoubtedly prevented war, which might, when started, very easily have embroiled the world. The power of America, Roosevelt believed, was the strongest influence against war. When he was conscious of a veiled truculence in the Japanese diplomatic communications, the American battle fleet was ordered to make a cruise around the world, ostensibly for training, but really to show the world, and particularly the Asiatics, that the United States had ample means to enforce its rights in all waters and on every sea. Every particle of trouble with the Japanese government and the Japanese press, says Roosevelt in a letter, stopped like magic as soon as they found that our fleet had actually sailed and was obviously in good trim. As I told von Tirpitz, the German general, I thought it a good thing that the Japanese should know there were fleets of the white races which were totally different from the fleet of poor Rojestvensky. But Roosevelt was not a lover of war, in spite of the warlike stand he took on several occasions. In his efforts in bringing about peace between Japan and Russia resulted in the award to him of the Nobel Peace Prize of $40,000. The constructive work he accomplished while in office is too great to be even sketched in these brief pages. It was in Roosevelt's term, however, that the famous Panama Canal was begun and pushed toward completion. When his administration had ended and he was a private citizen once more, Roosevelt started on his famous hunting trip to the jungles of Africa, where he indulged to the full his love of excitement and his interest in natural history. He killed lion, hippopotamus, and elephant, tracking his game on foot, and having several narrow escapes from death by infuriated and wounded wild beasts. He then toured Europe on a trip the like of which has not fallen to the lot of any other living man, for he was feted and cheered like a monarch wherever he went, and received honors that never before in the history of the world had been accorded to a man in private life. Roosevelt returned to America more honored and loved than any other man in its wide boundaries, and with his usual energy he plunged once more into the political fight. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain, but entered the struggle with a spirit of heroism and patriotic duty that all men must respect whatever they think of his political ideas. When the time came again for the presidential struggle, Roosevelt, who disliked the way things had been going since his term of office, once more became a candidate, and as he was repudiated by the Republicans, he formed a party of his own which he called the Progressive Party, and ran for president against Taft and Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had the solid Democratic vote behind him, and while the total of the votes he received made him a minority president, he was able nevertheless to win on account of the friction between Roosevelt and Taft. And Roosevelt now retired to his home on Sagamore Hill, Long Island, where, although he was a private citizen again, his voice was constantly heard throughout the country, with more influence on public affairs than any other force outside the administration. When time for the next election came, the Republicans nominated Hughes, and Roosevelt retired from the race to aid the fight against Wilson, who was nevertheless reelected. In spite of his political defeat, these years may well be considered as among the greatest in Roosevelt's life. More than any other man, he stood for true Americanism and showed a bewildered country the straight path toward the light of patriotism. He was among the first to condemn the German outrages, to silence the voices of supine pacifists, and plead for action on the part of the American government. He was the staunchest advocate of national preparedness, and we may say that the military training camps that gave America officers for the war were fathered by Roosevelt as well as by his friend and comrade in arms, General Wood, who was sponsor of the Plattsburgh idea. Before this, however, Roosevelt's restless spirit took him again into the wilderness, and with a body of chosen companions he had explored the Brazilian jungles and penetrated wilds where no white man had ever set foot before. In this journey, however, Roosevelt fell ill to a severe attack of tropical fever that even his robust frame and vigorous constitution could not shake off. He was now a sick man and growing old, but his bodily weakness did not hinder his strong voice that was so bravely uplifted in behalf of the best ideals of his country. When the war broke out with Germany, Roosevelt wished to go. He offered to raise and train a force for service on European battlefields, just as he had done in the Spanish War 19 years before. His offer was refused, and bitterly disappointed, Roosevelt was compelled to stay at home and watch other men fight, a fact that is thought to have hastened his death. He had hoped that his might be the lot of dying on the battlefield, but as he could not do this, he did the next best thing. He sent his 4 sons to represent him. As all 4 were among the first to volunteer, it can hardly be said, however, that Roosevelt sent them. None the less, the training they had received at his hands is doubtless partly responsible for their splendid service, and the fact that all strove for and obtained positions with combat troops. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep, a prey to the fever that he had contracted in South America and to inflammatory rheumatism with other complications. His death caused mourning all over the United States and brought a personal sense of loss to the heart of every American. Like Lincoln, Roosevelt is a man of the ages, and his name has been made immortal. And his last message, which he read only the night before he died to the members of the American Defense Society, is symbolic and typical of Roosevelt the man. "We have room but for one flag," he said, "the American flag. We have room but for one loyalty, and that is loyalty to the American people." So spoke Theodore Roosevelt a few hours before he died, and his words sum up the work of his great life. End of chapter 28. Theodore Roosevelt.